A 74-year-old woman drove alone through the dark. Behind her, a house filled with 40 years of memories. Ahead, a place no one had seen in over a decade. And then, on an empty stretch of road in northern Maine, the engine died. For a moment, it felt like the journey was over. But what happened next would quietly change the course of her life. If stories like this one stay with you, I hope you'll consider subscribing so we can walk this road together. Now, let me tell you about Midge. The kitchen smelled of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Midge Phelps sat at the table with both hands around the ceramic mug, not drinking, just holding. The mug had a chip on the rim that she always turned away from her mouth without thinking about it, the way a person adjusts to small imperfections after enough years of living with them. The kitchen was narrow. Oak cabinets that Garrett had installed the summer. Clark was born sanded smooth and sealed with 3 coats of polyurethane because Garrett did not believe in cutting corners on things that hands would touch every day. A window above the sink that faced east where the light came in pale and thin during winter mornings and lay across the counter like something that had traveled a long distance to arrive. A clock on the wall with a second hand that moved in small deliberate jumps, each one louder than it should have been in a room this quiet. She had lived in this house for 42 years. Every wall held something. The hallway where Clark had measured his height against the doorframe with a pencil until he was 16 and stopped caring. The living room where Noreen had practiced her physical therapy exercises on a folding mat, methodical even as a teenager. The back porch where Boyd used to sit with a library book while the rain came down, never once asking to come inside, as though he preferred the company of weather to the company of certainty. Midge had grown smaller over the years, not fragile, contained. Her shoulders curved gently forward, shaped by decades of reaching across counters and leaning into tasks rather than away from them. Her hair had gone from a warm auburn to a silver white that she kept in a loose knot at the base of her neck, secured with a tortoiseshell clip that Garrett had bought her at a craft fair in Camden 30 years ago. Her eyes were gray-blue and steady, the kind that noticed when a picture frame was tilted a quarter inch, or when a person was lying about being fine. She had risen before sunrise the way she always did, made the coffee, stood at the window, watched the street where nothing moved except the slow shift of shadow as the earth turned beneath a winter sky that could not decide between gray and white. She had checked the thermostat, adjusted it 1 degree, made a mental note about the heater which had started making a knocking sound 2 nights ago, sharp and uneven. The kind of sound that meant something inside was working harder than it should have been. She would call someone if it happened again. She still handled these things herself. She always had, even when Garrett was alive, because Garrett had taught her that knowing how a house worked was the same as knowing how to live in one. Then came the sound of car doors, one, then another, then a third, and voices. Familiar but layered together in a way she had not heard in years. All 3 of them. Midge did not need to look. Her children rarely arrived at the same time. Their lives had stretched outward into different cities, different schedules, different versions of adulthood that no longer required her participation. Bringing them together like this took coordination. That was her first sign. The front door opened without knocking. It made the sound it always made now, a low creak followed by a catch, the wood swelling against the frame in a way it never used to. Garrett had adjusted that door 3 times over the years, shimming the hinges, planing the edge, until it closed with a clean, quiet click. The click of a thing fitting exactly where it belonged. After he died, the wood shifted. Midge heard the creak every morning, every evening, every time the wind pushed against the frame. She could have fixed it. She knew how. She had watched Garrett do it enough times to understand the mechanics. But she left it. The creak was the last sound in the house that still belonged to him, and she was not ready to let it go. Clark came through first. 49 years old, broad through the shoulders, his hair cut short in a way that suggested efficiency rather than vanity. He wore a pressed shirt even though it was Saturday, and his jaw was set in the particular way it always was when he had already made up his mind about something and was now simply waiting for everyone else to agree. He worked as a branch manager at a regional bank in Portland, a job that had trained him to assess risk, calculate outcomes, and move forward without hesitation. It was not cruelty that drove him. It was the conviction that problems existed to be solved, and that solving them quickly was a form of kindness. Noreen followed. She carried a structured leather bag and a folder that she placed on the table with the kind of precision that suggested the contents had already been reviewed more than once. 46, a dark blonde hair in a clean bob, posture that never softened, not because she was cold, but because she had spent 20 years running a physical therapy clinic where discipline was indistinguishable from compassion. She believed in preparation the way some people believe in prayer, totally and without apology. Boyd came last. He paused in the doorway, his coat still buttoned, his hands in his pockets. 42 taller than his siblings, but leaner, with dark hair that was slightly longer than Clark would have approved of. A high school history teacher in Bangor. He carried a different kind of presence, quieter, less certain, shaped by years of standing in front of classrooms full of teenagers and understanding that most of the important things in life could not be answered on a test. His eyes met Midge's briefly, and something passed between them. Not agreement, recognition. He knew what was coming, and he did not want to be here for it, and he had come anyway. "Morning, Mom." Clark was already moving toward the table. "Hi, Mom." Noreen set her bag down. Boyd gave a small nod. "Hey, Mom." Midge smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes because it is not trying to. "You're all here." That's rare. No one answered that directly. They sat. Midge noticed the way Noreen aligned her folder with the edge of the table. The way Clark leaned forward, elbows planted, already positioned to speak. Boyd sat back, hands loosely clasped in his lap, watching the others the way he always had, as if he were a student in someone else's classroom. The pause lasted long enough for the quiet to become deliberate. Then Clark cleared his throat. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it's time to have a real conversation about what comes next." Midge nodded once. "All right." Noreen opened the folder and slid a set of glossy brochures across the table. Bright photographs, sunlit corridors, smiling residents standing in gardens that looked too green for any place that existed in actual weather. The name across the top read, Harbor Pines Assisted Living, and beneath it in smaller letters, a community designed for comfort, safety, and peace of mind. Midge glanced at the brochures but did not touch them. "They have full-time medical staff," Clark said. "Activities. Meals prepared for you. It's one of the best-rated facilities in the state. You wouldn't have to worry about the house anymore," Noreen added. "Or being alone." "I'm not worried," Midge said. Boyd leaned forward slightly. "We just want to make sure you're okay." "I am okay." Clark exhaled through his nose. "Mom, the house is a lot for one person. The heater's making noise again. The roof needs work. At your age, we have to be realistic about what happens when something goes wrong. No one's here. I have neighbors, and a phone, and a doctor who has not once suggested I need to leave my home." Noreen's voice tightened by a fraction. "This isn't about right now. It's about what could happen." Clark tapped the brochure with one finger. "We've already spoken to the admissions office. There's an opening in March. We put your name down." The words entered the room and sat there heavy and still, like furniture no one had asked for. "You put my name down." "Just to hold the spot," Noreen said. "There's no commitment yet." Midge looked at each of them in turn. Clark, who would not look away. Noreen, who looked directly at her, but through a carefully prepared expression. Boyd, who was looking at the table. "You've been planning this for a while." "Yes." Clark did not hesitate. "And none of you thought to ask me first." The silence that followed was different from the one before. This one had weight. Boyd shifted in his chair. Clark leaned back, softening his voice by a degree the way a person adjusts their tone when they realize they have misjudged the room. "We're trying to take care of you, Mom." Midge turned her gaze toward the window. The yard beyond it was brown and still, the fence leaning slightly where the frost had shifted the post. The house was not perfect. She knew that better than any of them. She knew which step on the back porch gave when you stood on its left edge. She knew the bathroom faucet needed a quarter turn past the point where the handle stopped to get hot water. She knew the furnace made that knocking sound because the circulator pump was aging and the expansion tank needed to be checked. She knew all of it the way you know the body of someone you have loved for a long time. Every flaw mapped, every weakness accounted for, and none of it enough to make you leave. "What happens to the house?" she asked. Clark and Noreen exchanged a glance. "The market is strong right now," Clark said. "Selling would make sense. It would cover everything Noreen added, your care, your expenses, and it would take the pressure off for all of us. For all of us." Midge heard it. Not just the words, but the small thing living beneath them. The thing none of them had said out loud. This was not only about her safety. This was about convenience. About simplifying a situation that had become in their carefully organized lives inconvenient. She looked down at her hands on the table, hands that had shelved books for 28 years, that had kneaded bread on this counter, that had held 3 newborns and 1 dying man. Hands that still worked, still gripped, still knew the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead without looking. "I see," she said. The brochures stayed where Noreen had placed them, their glossy surfaces catching the pale morning light. And in that moment, something shifted inside Midge with a clarity that surprised her. They were not asking. They had already decided. And for the first time in a very long time, something inside her did not step aside. The house felt different after they left, not emptier, more aware, as though the walls had been listening and were now deciding what to do with what they had heard. Midge stacked the brochures neatly, aligned the corners, moved them to the far edge of the table where they could sit without requiring anything from her. Then she turned to the sink and washed the mug slowly, deliberately running water over ceramic that did not need cleaning. Because when something inside her felt unsettled, she had always found a small task and done it until the feeling either passed or became something she could name. The water stopped. The quiet returned. She dried her hands and walked into the living room. Garrett stood in the photograph the way he always had, sleeves pushed to his elbows, a pencil behind his ear, one hand resting on a boat frame in his shop. He was not looking at the camera. He never did. His attention was always on the work, on the grain of the wood, on the joint he was fitting, on whatever small imperfection he could still correct before the glue set. He had been a man who built things to last. Boats that held in heavy water, shelves that did not bow under weight. A house that he had constructed with his own hands over the course of 7 years, 1 room at a time, after long days at the boatyard. Each piece measured and fitted with a patience that most people mistook for slowness. And the door, the front door. Ashwood, hand-planed, hung on 3-point hinges that he had adjusted and readjusted until it swung true and closed with that sound, that clean, definitive click, the sound of something arriving exactly where it was supposed to be. Midge could still hear it if she listened carefully enough. Not in the house. The house made a different sound now. The creak, the catch. But somewhere behind the creak, if she held very still, she could hear the click the way you can sometimes hear a conversation from years ago if the room is quiet enough and you are willing to listen. She stood there for a long time. Then she moved past the photograph down the hallway to the lower drawer beneath the kitchen counter where older things were kept. The deed was at the bottom, folded inside an envelope that had softened with age. She brought it to the table and sat down. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the names were clear. Garrett Phelps, Marjorie Phelps. A parcel of land near Rangeley in the lake region of western Maine, purchased 23 years ago for a price that had seemed like a lot of money at the time and now seemed like nothing at all. She remembered the first time they stood there. Late June. Garrett walked the clearing without speaking, his boots pressing into the soft ground, his gaze moving not across what was there, but across what could be. Birch and spruce bordered the edges. The lake was visible through a gap in the trees, flat and silver in the afternoon light. "It's not much," he said. "It doesn't have to be," she answered. He started building that autumn. foundation first. Then the frame rising slowly through the following spring and summer. Boards fitted and braced with the same care he gave to everything. Midge stayed nearby on those weekends, handing him tools, brushing sawdust from surfaces, learning the rhythm of his work without needing instruction. They talked about it in fragments. Morning coffee on a porch that did not exist yet. Evenings by a wood stove, listening to the loons on the lake. A smaller life, a quieter one. Not an ending, a choosing. He never finished. The cough came first, then the tiredness that did not lift. Then the diagnosis delivered by a doctor who spoke with the careful distance of a man who had said these things too many times. Garrett listened. That was what Midge remembered most. He did not argue, did not bargain. He simply listened the way he listened to wood when he was fitting a joint, hearing what the material would and would not allow. The house at Rangeley stayed exactly as he left it. Frame complete, walls standing but open, a roof that held rain but not winter, and a doorway with no door, just a frame. Hinges bolted to one side waiting for a panel that never came. Garrett had said the door was always last. You build the door when everything else is right, he told her once. Because the door is how you know you're finished. He never got to finish. Midge had not gone back. At first there were reasons, paperwork, phone calls, the details that accumulate when a life ends, and the world continues to require forms and signatures, and the settling of accounts. Later the reason simplified into something harder to explain. She stayed away because going back meant standing inside something that should have been completed and was not. And she did not know whether that would feel like grief or failure, and she was not sure she could survive either one. She sat at the kitchen table now with the deed spread flat before her fingers resting on the paper, and she understood something she had not allowed herself to consider for 3 years. Not everything unfinished is meant to stay that way. She reached for the phone. The law office of Harold Stanhope answered on the fourth ring. Harold had known Garrett since before the children were born. He was the kind of lawyer who kept his files in alphabetical order and his opinions to himself unless asked. His voice was older now, slower, but still clear. Harold, this is Midge Phelps. A pause, then quieter. Well, I didn't expect to hear from you today. I need to ask about the property in Rangeley. The land and the structure. I need to confirm it's still mine. It is, entirely. No liens, no encumbrances. Your name is the only one on the title now, and my children have no claim to it. Not unless you choose to give them one. Another pause, longer this time. Then Harold added gently, You are of sound mind, Midge. That is all that matters in the eyes of the law. Midge nodded, though he could not see her. When the call ended, the silence in the kitchen felt different. Not empty, clear, like a window someone had opened. She placed the deed back in its envelope but did not return it to the drawer. This time she left it on the table where she could see it. She did not rush. Over the next 10 days, she prepared with the kind of quiet efficiency that looks ordinary from the outside and only reveals its purpose after it is done. At the grocery store, she moved the same way she always had, slow, deliberate, unremarkable. But her choices had changed. Canned goods, dry pasta, oatmeal, things that would keep. She placed a few items in the cart, each time enough to look normal, never enough to draw attention. At the pharmacy, she refilled her prescriptions and asked Lena, the pharmacist, a few careful questions about storage temperatures and shelf life. Lena answered without curiosity. People asked practical questions all the time. At home, Midge did not pack everything into one bag. She spread her preparations across the house. A duffel in the hall closet. Warm layers folded in a canvas tote near the bedroom door. Garrett's old toolkit, the one with the wooden handle he had replaced twice, set beside the front door, where she would not forget it. The suitcase came down from the attic on a Tuesday afternoon. Its edges were scuffed, the zipper stiff but functional. She opened it on the bed and stood there for a moment before placing anything inside. Then she began. Practical clothes, a wool coat that had outlasted 3 winters and would outlast 3 more. boots with tread that still gripped. One photograph, Garrett on the porch in Brunswick, squinting into the sun, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a pencil in the other, as if he had been interrupted between two kinds of work. She drove the car to Bradshaw's garage on the edge of town. Tom Bradshaw was a wide man with grease-darkened hands and a face shaped by weather and patience. He spoke the way he worked, directly, without wasted motion. "You heading somewhere? Just want to make sure it'll make it." Tom looked at the car the way Garrett used to look at boats, not at the surface, but at the structure underneath. He spent 40 minutes beneath the hood. When he came back, he wiped his hands on a rag and studied her for a moment. "It'll hold. Just don't push it." Midge nodded. "I won't." He looked like he wanted to say something else. Then he didn't. That was something she appreciated about Tom. He understood the value of a sentence left unspoken. On the last evening, Midge moved through the house slowly. Her hand brushed the back of the kitchen chair, the edge of the hallway table, the frame of the living room doorway, where 3 children had once been small enough to measure. She did not linger. She was not saying goodbye. She was acknowledging the way you nod to someone you have known a long time as you pass them on the street. Not because there is something to say, but because the seeing is enough. She paused in the living room. Garrett in the photograph, the pencil behind his ear, the half-built frame beneath his hand. "I'll finish it," she said quietly. She turned off the light. She stood at the front door, placed her hand on the wood. The creak was there, the same catch, the same swollen resistance. She listened to it the way you listen to a heartbeat when you know it is the last time you will be this close. Then she pulled the door shut behind her, and the latch caught with a dull, imperfect sound that was nothing like the click she remembered, and she walked to the car without looking back. She left before the sky had made up its mind about morning. The air was cold enough to settle into the joints of her fingers, but not sharp. The engine turned over on the second try with a sound like a throat being cleared after a long silence. She let it idle for a moment. Then she drove. Brunswick passed in pieces. Houses dark, streets empty. The library where she had worked for 28 years, its windows black, its book drop shadow visible from the road. The intersection where Garrett had once stopped the car to let a fox cross, unhurried its tail, low its eyes reflecting the headlights with the calm indifference of a creature that did not care whether it was observed. Then the town ended. Route 4 opened northward, the road narrowing as it climbed into the interior. The trees closed in spruce and birch, alternating in the headlights, their branches heavy with the weight of a winter that had not yet decided whether to deepen or relent. She did not rush. She remembered what Tom had said. The hours passed in a kind of quiet awareness that was different from the silence of the house. That silence had been the absence of something. This was the presence of space. Miles unfolding. The hum of the tires on pavement. The heater pushing warmth against the windshield in a steady mechanical breath. She was somewhere past Farmington when the sound started. A low vibration beneath the floor, subtle at first, then sharper. The engine stuttered, caught, stuttered again. Midge eased her foot off the gas, both hands steady on the wheel, and guided the car to the shoulder. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. The engine made one last hollow attempt, then stopped. The silence that followed was not the silence of her kitchen. It was larger, less contained. The road stretched empty in both directions, bordered by trees that stood like witnesses to something they had seen too many times to find remarkable. Midge stepped out. The cold was immediate, sharper here, without the shelter of buildings. She walked around the car, slowly, her hand resting on the hood, warm but silent. "Well," she said, to no one and to everything. "That's far enough for now." The sound of a vehicle came not long after. Steady, unhurried, the kind of engine note that belongs to a truck that has been maintained out of respect rather than obligation. It slowed as it approached and stopped behind her. The driver stepped out first. Hollis Renwick carried his height with a slight forward lean, the kind that develops over decades of bending toward things that need building fixing or lifting. His beard was full and grey-trimmed, close enough to suggest care, but not vanity. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles in the way that hands get when they have spent more time holding tools than holding pens. "You stuck?" Midge gave a small nod. "Looks that way." Hollis was already at the hood. He looked for less than a minute. Closed it. Not roadside work, I figured. He glanced at the road, then at the car, then at her. The look lasted 2 seconds longer than polite. He was not assessing her the way Clark would have, calculating risk and liability. He was reading her the way a carpenter reads a piece of wood, looking for the grain, the direction, the thing that tells you what it wants to become. "You close to where you're going?" "Yes." "We'll take you." It was not a question. It was a statement made by a man who understood that some moments do not require permission, only presence. The truck cab smelled of sawdust and cold coffee. Midge gave directions in short sentences. Left at the fork, past the boat launch, the gravel road after the mailbox with no name. When the structure came into view through the trees, Midge felt it before she saw it, a settling in her chest, a recognition that lived somewhere beneath language. The house stood where it always had, but time had not been patient. The wood had darkened. The frame leaned slightly where frost and thaw had worked at the footings over years of neglect. The roof held, though not with conviction. The windows were clouded, their frames swollen. And the doorway. The doorway stood open the way Garrett had left it. Hinges bolted to one side, still waiting for a door that had never arrived. Wind moved through the frame and into the house and out the other side, as if the building were not a shelter, but a passage, a thing the world walked through on its way to somewhere else. "This it?" Hollis asked. Midge nodded. They stepped out together. The ground shifted slightly beneath her feet, uneven, half-frozen, familiar, in a way that reached past memory into something older. She stood still, took it in, not with regret, not with grief, with recognition. Hollis tested the front step, placed his weight carefully. It held. Inside, the air was colder than outside, carrying the scent of old wood and seasons that had passed through without anyone there to notice them. Light came in unevenly through the gaps stretching across the rough floor in pale angled lines. Hollis walked slowly along one wall, pressing his palm flat against the frame at intervals, the way a doctor presses a stethoscope to a chest, listening for what is working and what is not. "Whoever built this knew what he was doing," he said. Midge did not answer immediately. She was standing in the doorway, one hand resting against the frame where the hinges waited. The metal was cold under her fingers. Rust had formed along the edges, but the bolts held firm. Garrett had set them deep. "My husband," she said. Hollis looked at her, then at the frame, then back at the room. He nodded once, and it was the kind of nod that carries more than agreement. It carries understanding. He stepped outside and came back with an armload of firewood from the truck bed. Split birch seasoned dry enough to catch. He built the fire without asking, the way a person does when they have lived alone long enough to know that warmth is not a luxury but a decision, and that the decision should be made before it becomes necessary. The flames took time. The wood resisted at first, then caught, then held. The heat pushed outward slowly, reaching into corners that had not felt warmth in years. Hollis set a folded wool blanket near the wall. "You can manage tonight," he said. Not a question, an assessment. Midge nodded. "I'll come back in the morning. Bring a few things." Again, not an offer, a continuation, as if what had begun on the side of the road was not an interruption, but the start of something that would take more than one day to understand. He left without ceremony. The truck engine faded down the gravel road and the quiet returned. But it was not the quiet Midge had known in Brunswick. That quiet had been the sound of absence. This quiet was the sound of space that was waiting to be filled. She sat near the fire, her hands extended toward the warmth, and looked at the walls around her. Unfinished, open. The frame standing but incomplete, the roof holding but uncertain, the doorway empty, the wind still finding its way through. And yet, something had already begun to return. Not Garrett, not the past, something else. something that had been waiting the way the hinges had been waiting, with patience and with rust, and with the quiet certainty that sooner or later someone would come back to finish what had been started. Midge pulled the blanket around her shoulders. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the lake was invisible in the darkness, but she could feel it there, the way you feel the presence of something large and still, when you cannot see it but know it has not moved. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence did not feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she had chosen. In the morning, she would begin. Morning did not arrive gently. It came with cold that had deepened overnight, pressing through the blanket, through her coat, through the layers she had worn to bed. Because undressing in a house without insulation in January in Maine was not stubbornness but stupidity, and Midge Phelps had never been stupid. She opened her eyes. The fire had gone out, not recently. The ash was cold when she touched it, which meant it had died sometime in the hours before dawn while she slept. And she had not woken, which meant she had slept deeply, which surprised her more than the cold did. The light inside the house was gray, and even entering through every gap in the walls, through the clouded windows, through the doorway where the wind had quieted sometime in the night but not stopped. Her breath came in small, visible clouds. Her fingers were stiff. Her left knee, the one that had been unreliable since a fall on the library steps 8 years ago, announced itself with a dull, spreading ache when she tried to stand. She stood anyway. The first task was fire. She had watched Hollis build one the night before, had noted the way he arranged the kindling in a loose tent rather than a flat stack, the way he used birch bark as a starter, because it caught faster than newspaper and burned hotter. She knelt at the hearth and tried to replicate what she had seen. The bark caught. The kindling did not. She rearranged, tried again. The flame licked upward, found nothing to hold, and went out. On the fourth attempt, her hands shaking not from fear, but from cold, the kindling caught. The flame held. She fed it slowly, one piece at a time, resisting the urge to add too much too fast. Because Garrett had told her once that fire was like trust. You build it in small increments, and if you rush it, you lose everything you've started. By the time the warmth reached her hands, 20 minutes had passed. She ate oatmeal from a pot she heated over the fire using the camping stove she had packed as a backup, but not needing it yet. The oatmeal was thick, slightly burnt where it touched the bottom of the pot, and she ate all of it because calories were not a preference now. They were a resource, and she could not afford to waste any. Then she stood in the center of the room and looked. The house was roughly 20 feet by 24. One large room that Garrett had intended to divide into a living space and a kitchen, with a second room to the north that would have been the bedroom. The framing was all there, studs 16 inches on center headers, properly sized, the bones of a house that understood what it was supposed to become. But the skin was incomplete. Sections of the exterior wall were sheathed in plywood. Others left open, covered only by the house wrap that had torn in several places over the years. The white material hanging in strips that moved in the wind, like flags of a country that no longer existed. The floor was plywood subfloor warped in 2 places where moisture had entered. The roof was intact overhead but questionable toward the north wall, where she could see a discoloration that suggested water had been finding a way in. The wood stove sat in the corner, a cast iron box with a flue pipe that rose through a metal collar in the ceiling. It worked. That was the most important thing. Everything else was negotiable. She retrieved Garrett's toolkit from beside her bag, unzipped it. The tools lay in their pockets the way he had left them, each one in its place, the way he kept everything with a precision that was not obsessive but respectful. She picked up the tape measure and pulled it to its full extension. The metallic snap when it retracted was the loudest sound in the house. She started with the torn house wrap. The work went poorly, not dangerously, not catastrophically, but with the accumulation of small failures that is the experience of anyone who attempts skilled labor without current practice. She cut a patch from the roll of Tyvek she had bought in Brunswick, measured it against the gap and stapled it in place. The staple gun required more grip strength than she remembered. The first three staples went in crooked. The fourth missed the stud entirely. She repositioned, squeezed again, and the patch buckled because she had not pulled it taut before fastening. She tore it off and started over. By the time Hollis arrived at 9:30, she had patched 2 sections and ruined 3. Her hands were raw from the cold and the staple gun, and there was a scratch across her left forearm where a torn edge of house wrap had caught her when the wind shifted. Hollis looked at the patches, then at her hands, then at the patches again. "You're pulling before you pin," he said. "Pin the top first. Let gravity help you." He did not take the staple gun from her. He stood beside her and watched while she tried again. This time she pinned the top edge, let the material hang, pulled it flat from the bottom, and stapled the sides. It held. It was not beautiful, but it held. Hollis gave a single nod and moved to the north wall, where the roof discoloration had been worrying her since sunrise. He climbed a ladder he had brought in the truck bed and was on the roof for 10 minutes. When he came down, his expression had not changed. Flashings failed along the ridge cap. Water's been getting under the shingles probably 2 winters now. "I can patch it, but it needs to be done before the next storm." "How long?" "Today if the wind stays down." He worked on the roof without conversation. Midge could hear his boots moving overhead. The rhythmic tap of a hammer, the occasional scrape of a pry bar lifting damaged shingles. She continued with the walls. By noon, she had covered 4 of the 6 exposed sections. Her shoulders ached in a way that felt productive rather than punishing, the difference between pain that comes from doing something and pain that comes from sitting still. She stepped outside to rest and found on the front step a paper bag she had not seen arrive. Inside, a thermos of soup still warm, 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, an apple. No note, no name. She looked toward the road. Tire tracks in the frost that were not Hollis's. Someone had come, left this, and driven away without knocking. She sat on the step and ate the soup, which was potato and leek, and tasted like someone who knew what they were doing in a kitchen. Hollis came down from the roof, and she offered him a biscuit without explanation, and he took it without asking where it came from, and they ate in silence, sitting 4 feet apart on a step that barely held both of them. The afternoon brought more work and a visitor. A truck pulled into the clearing, newer than Hollis's, and a woman stepped out carrying a cardboard box. Winona Patchett was 58 years old, with short brown hair streaked with gray, and a face that did not waste time arriving at its expressions. She wore a canvas jacket with a name tag stitched above the pocket that read, "Wins," which was the name of the diner she operated in Rangeley Village, a place Midge had never been to, but which Garrett had mentioned once years ago as having the best chowder north of Portland. "Hollis called me," Winona said, setting the box on the step. "I brought things." The box contained canned beans, rice, a bag of ground coffee, a box of matches, 2 rolls of paper towels, a bar of soap, and a flashlight with batteries already installed. Midge looked at the box, then at Winona. "I have money. I can pay for these." Winona waved the words away the way you wave away a fly that is not bothering you enough to stand up for. "Nobody asked you to pay. I brought things because things are what you need. When you don't need them anymore, you can bring things to someone who does." She looked past Midge at the house, then at the patches on the wall, then back at Midge. "You're doing this yourself." It was not a question and not quite an accusation. It occupied the space between the two where honest observation lives. "My husband started it," Midge said. Winona studied her for a moment. She had the expression of a woman who had heard enough stories to know when one was being told from the middle rather than the beginning, and who had enough patience to wait for the rest. Then she nodded. "I'll come back Thursday. If you need something before that, the diner's open 6 to 2. Don't be proud about it." She left without ceremony. Thursday came, and with it Winona. And this time, she did not just bring supplies. She brought Russell Brewer. Russell was 63, lean with a shaved head, and a face that carried the particular stillness of a man who had spent a portion of his life in places where stillness meant survival. He had served in the Navy for 14 years, came home to Rangeley, Because his mother was here, stayed because his mother died, and leaving felt like abandoning her twice. He worked as a plumber, now semi-retired, taking jobs when he wanted them, and declining the rest. He walked through the house without greeting Midge, which was not rudeness but professional focus. He checked the pipes, the well connection, the water heater that was not a water heater, but a rusted tank that had not held water in a decade. He knelt at joint-pressed fittings, ran his hand along copper that had greened with oxidation. When he finished, he stood in the center of the room and addressed Hollis rather than Midge, which was the way men of a certain generation communicated, when they did not yet know how to talk to the person who needed the information most. Well, pump's intact. Lines need flushing. That tank's done, but I've got one at my place that'll work. Give me 2 days. Midge cleared her throat. He turned. Thank you, she said. What do I owe you? Russell looked at her as if she had asked him the weight of a color. Hollis said, you were rebuilding your husband's house. I'm not charging a widow to get water in her husband's house. He left. The water ran 3 days later, brown at first, then clear. Midge stood at the kitchen sink that Garrett had roughed in but never connected. And she turned the handle and water came cold and clean, and tasting of iron and stone. And she let it run over her hands until they ached from the cold, because the feeling of water in this house was not a convenience but a resurrection. That night she found it. She had been clearing debris from the base of the north wall, where the moisture damage was worst. Pieces of sheathing that had buckled, old insulation that had degraded into a gray, powdery mess, a nest of dried grass where something small had once lived and no longer did. Behind the insulation, tucked into the space between two studs, her fingers touched metal. A tin box, rectangular the size of a paperback novel, its lid sealed with electrical tape that had dried and cracked but not released. She pried it open carefully. Inside a folded piece of paper, heavy stock, the kind used for drafting. And beneath it, a smaller piece lined notebook paper written in pencil. She unfolded the drafting paper first. It was the floor plan. Not a sketch, not an approximation, but a detailed architectural drawing done in Garrett's precise hand. Every measurement noted. Every window placement marked, every room labeled in his small square printing. Living room, kitchen, bedroom. A porch along the south-facing wall, 6 feet deep, with a notation that read, Morning sun, 2 chairs, coffee. The notebook paper was different. The handwriting was looser, as if written at the end of a long day when his hands were tired and his guard was down. For Midge, when she's ready, 5 words. She sat on the cold floor with the papers in her lap and the fire she had built that morning. Her fire built without help with kindling. She had split herself using a hatchet from Garrett's kit. Cast moving light across the drawings, illuminating the rooms that did not yet exist, the porch where 2 chairs would someday sit. The life that had been planned in pencil and paused by something that pencils cannot account for. She did not cry. She pressed her palm flat against the notebook paper, feeling the slight indentation where the pencil had pushed hard enough to leave a physical impression in the fiber. And she held it there until the warmth of her hand had transferred into the paper, until it was no longer cold, until it carried something of her as well as something of him. For Midge, when she's ready, she was ready. The days after the discovery had a different quality, not faster, more intentional. Midge pinned the floor plan to the wall near the wood stove where the light was best. And each morning she stood before it the way a navigator stands before a chart, orienting herself, choosing the next heading. Hollis saw it the first morning, studied it for a full minute without speaking. Then he pointed to the porch notation. Morning sun, 2 chairs, coffee. He knew where to put the porch, Hollis said. That's southeast exposure, best light in winter. And that was all he said about it. But from that morning forward, the work between them shifted. It was no longer Hollis helping Midge. It was 2 people building from the same set of plans, and the plans belonged to a man who was not there, but whose judgment neither of them questioned. Others came. Not in a crowd. In ones and twos, the way help arrives in small towns, not announced but accumulated. The way snow gathers one flake, meaningless 1,000, undeniable. A woman whose name Midge never learned left a stack of 2x4s at the edge of the clearing. A man in a green jacket dropped off a box of screws and a tube of construction adhesive and was gone before Midge reached the door. Winona brought not only food but information. The name of a man in Oquasock who sold reclaimed windows, cheap the location of a sawmill that would cut lumber to specification if you brought your own logs. Midge kept a notebook, wrote down every name she learned, every item received, every hour donated. Not to repay, she understood by now that repayment was not the currency being used, but to remember. To know on the days when the work felt too large and her body felt too small that she was not imagining this, that it was real, that people she had not known 3 weeks ago were choosing without obligation or reward to help her finish what Garrett had started. The first real success came at the end of the 3rd week. Hollis and Midge framed and sheathed the final exterior wall section. It took an entire day. The temperature never rose above 20. Midge's fingers cramped around the hammer so badly by afternoon that she switched to holding boards while Hollis nailed. But she did not stop, and when the last sheet of plywood was secured and the wall was complete, all 4 walls closed. The house sealed against the wind for the first time since Garrett had set it down. They stood back and looked at it. The wind hit the wall and did not come through. Midge placed her hand flat against the plywood. The surface trembled slightly with the impact of the gusts outside, but it held. She could feel the difference immediately. The air inside was still, not warm yet, but still, contained. The house was no longer a passage the world walked through. It was a space, her space. Hollis picked up his thermos and poured coffee into 2 cups without asking whether she wanted any. They sat on overturned buckets near the stove and drank in silence, and the silence was the kind that exists between people who have worked hard enough together to no longer need conversation to confirm that they are both present. February arrived without announcement the way it does in northern Maine, by making everything slightly worse. The temperature dropped. The snow that fell was dry and fine, more like sand than precipitation driven sideways by wind that came off the lake with nothing to stop it between the water and the house except 200 yards of frozen ground. Midge adapted. She wore 3 layers indoors, heated water on the wood stove for washing, learned which logs burned hot and fast and which burned slow and steady, and how to bank the fire at night so it would still have coals in the morning. Her hands developed calluses in places that had been soft for decades. Her sleep paradoxically improved. She slept the way people sleep when their bodies are genuinely tired, rather than merely resting deeply without the restless turning that had characterized her nights in Brunswick. And then the storm came. It arrived on a Thursday evening, announced by a drop in barometric pressure that Midge felt in her sinuses before the sky confirmed it. The clouds came from the northwest, low and dark and fast, the kind of clouds that do not bring weather but become it. By 8 o'clock, the wind was steady at 40 miles per hour. By 10, it was gusting to 70. Midge sat by the stove and listened. The house spoke differently in wind like this. The walls held, they were solid, now complete. But the roof, Hollis's patch job from 3 weeks ago, began to make sounds she had not heard before. A low groaning, rhythmic, as if something up there was being tested beyond its design tolerance. Then a sharper sound, a crack followed by the rush of air entering from a direction it should not have been able to enter from. She looked up. In the northeast corner of the ceiling, where the patch met the original shingles, a seam had opened. Not wide, but enough. Water would not come through tonight. The precipitation was snow, not rain, but the wind came through, and with it the cold, sudden and aggressive, a blade of air that cut through the warmth the stove had built over hours. She climbed the chair, reached for the gap. Her fingers touched the torn edge of shingle material, and she pulled, trying to fold it back, trying to seal what had opened. The wind fought her. The material was stiff with cold and age and would not bend without tearing further. She pulled harder. The chair shifted beneath her. She fell. Not far. 4 feet, maybe less. But she landed wrong, her left knee striking the subfloor at an angle that sent a white shock of pain up through her thigh and into her hip. She heard the sound before she felt it. A deep percussive impact, bone meeting wood. And then she was on the ground, and the pain was not sharp but spreading, filling her knee the way water fills a vessel, steadily, without hurry, without mercy. She lay on the plywood floor. The wind screamed through the gap above her. The fire in the stove had been dying even before she fell. And now the cold poured in from the breach, and she could feel the warmth being pulled from the room. The way a tide pulls water from the shore, slowly at first. Then all at once. She tried to stand. The knee refused. Not broken, she knew. Broken had broken a wrist at 53 falling on ice, but damaged enough to make standing an act of negotiation rather than will. She got to her hands and one good knee and crawled to the stove and fed it the last of the split wood and lay beside it on the floor with the wool blanket pulled around her and the wind coming through the ceiling and the temperature dropping degree by degree. The blueprint was on the wall above her. She could see it in the firelight. The rooms, the porch, the notation. Morning sun, 2 chairs, coffee. For Midge, when she's ready. She closed her eyes. The wind did not stop. The cold did not retreat. And for the first time since she had left Brunswick, the thought came not as words but as a feeling, a bone-deep fatigue that was not about sleep but about capacity. Maybe they were right. Maybe 74 was too old for this. Maybe a heated room and a prepared meal and a door that someone else maintained was not surrender but sense. Maybe the brochure with the sunlit corridors and the manicured gardens was not a cage, but a kindness, and she had been too proud to see it. She opened her eyes, looked at the blueprint, at Garrett's handwriting, at the small square letters that said Morning Sun, 2 chairs, coffee. 2 chairs. He had written 2. Even in the plan, even in the dream, he had not imagined sitting there alone. She pulled the blanket tighter, did not decide anything, did not resolve. Just held on through the dark hours while the storm worked against the house, and the house, imperfect and unfinished, held against the storm. She did not sleep. She waited. And when the first gray light of morning pressed through the clouded windows, and the wind had dropped from a scream to a moan, and the fire had burned down to a bed of coals that still against all expectation glowed, she heard the sound of tires on frozen gravel. Hollis's truck. And behind it another engine, then a third. She did not stand. She could not stand. She lay on the floor beside the stove with her knee swollen to twice its size and her hands still curled inside the blanket, and her breath coming in small clouds. And she listened to the doors opening, the boots on frozen ground, the voices low and calm and already moving toward the house. The first face through the doorway was Hollis. Behind him, Russell. Behind Russell, Winona carrying something that steamed. Nobody spoke. Hollis looked at the ceiling, looked at the chair on its side, looked at Midge on the floor. The equation was simple enough. He turned to Russell. Russell was already moving toward the ladder. Winona knelt beside Midge and set the thermos on the floor, and did not ask, "Are you all right?" because the answer was visible. And asking would have been a waste of the breath that was needed for other things. "Can you sit up?" she said. Midge sat up. It hurt in 3 places. She sat up anyway. Winona poured coffee into the thermos lid and put it in her hands, and Midge held it, and the warmth entered her fingers, and she drank, and the coffee was black and too strong and perfect. Above her, Hollis was already on the roof. She could hear the hammer, steady, measured, not rushed, not frantic, just the sound of a man doing what needed to be done at the speed it needed to be done at the same speed. Garrett would have used the speed of someone who respects the work enough not to hurry it. Russell was checking the stove flue for damage. Winona was unpacking food. Nobody asked Midge if she wanted to quit. Nobody asked her if this was worth it. Nobody mentioned assisted living or selling the house or what a reasonable person her age should be doing on a February morning in rural Maine. They just started over. And Midge sitting on the floor with a swollen knee and a cup of coffee she had not poured, and a blanket she had not washed, and a house that had almost failed her, but had not quite understood something. She had not understood the night before, when the storm was loudest and the cold was deepest, and the doubt had come in like water through a broken seal. She was not doing this alone. She had never been doing this alone. Even the night she spent by herself in this house, she was living inside a structure built by a man who had measured every joint, twice patched by a stranger who climbed a roof without being asked, supplied by a woman who believed that generosity was not charity but circulation, plumbed by a sailor who refused to charge a widow for water in her husband's house. The knee would heal, the roof would be fixed, the wall would hold. She was not finished, and neither was the house. The knee took 14 days to stop swelling, and another 7 before she could put full weight on it without her body flinching in anticipation of pain that was no longer there. During those 3 weeks, Midge did not leave the house. She did not need to. The house came to her. Winona arrived every second morning with food that was never the same thing twice. Soup one day, casserole the next, once a container of chowder so thick the spoon stood upright in it without assistance. She never stayed long. She set the food down, checked the woodpile, asked one practical question, accepted one practical answer, and left. It was the most efficient form of friendship Midge had ever experienced. Russell finished the plumbing on a Saturday, then came back Monday to insulate the pipes against the cold. He wrapped them in foam sleeves and secured the joints with heat tape, working in silence for 3 hours. When he was done, he stood up, looked at his work, and said one sentence. "That'll hold to 40 below." Then he put on his coat and drove away. Hollis came every day. He did not take days off, and he did not explain why. He repaired the roof damage from the storm. Not a patch this time, but a full replacement of the north section. New shingles laid in courses so straight they looked measured by machine. He reframed the section of ceiling where the wind had torn through sistered new joists alongside the originals, and sealed the ridge cap with a flashing technique that involved bending sheet metal by hand against a straight edge. A process Midge watched from below with the attention of someone who understood she was seeing a craft rather than a task. On the 8th day, she asked him a question she had been carrying since the morning he first arrived. "Why are you doing this?" Hollis was on the ladder. He did not look down. "My wife's name was June," he said. "She taught 2nd grade at the elementary school in Rangeley for 31 years. She died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago in March. Took 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She weighed 92 pounds at the funeral." He drove a nail, positioned the next shingle. June wanted to build a greenhouse. She drew it on graph paper, the dimensions, the shelving, where the light would come in. "She asked me to build it the spring before she got sick. I said I'd get to it after the deck was done. The deck took longer than I planned. It always does. Another nail. I never built the greenhouse." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The space between his words contained everything that connected them. Two people who understood what it meant to stand inside a structure that should have been finished and was not, and who knew that the only answer to that understanding was to pick up a hammer and begin. Midge did not respond. She handed him another shingle from the stack. Spring announced itself the way it does in western Maine, not with warmth but with the sound of water. The ice on the lake cracked first at the edges, then in long groaning fractures that carried across the surface like the complaints of something ancient being asked to change its mind. Snow retreated from the clearing in uneven patches, revealing ground that was dark and wet and alive with the particular smell of earth, returning to itself after months of compression. Midge walked outside each morning. Now slowly, the knee still tender but functional, and she could feel the difference in the air. Not warmer exactly, but less hostile, as if the season had decided it had made its point and was willing to negotiate. She started the garden on the first day the soil was soft enough to accept a shovel. A patch of ground on the south side of the house, roughly 10 by 12 feet, bordered by stones, she collected from the edge of the clearing. She turned the earth by hand, working in sections, breaking the compacted clay and root mass into something that would eventually accept seeds. It was the hardest physical work she had done since arriving, harder than the walls, harder than the roof, because soil does not cooperate the way wood does. Wood can be measured, cut, fitted. Soil has its own memory, its own preferences, its own way of resisting what you want it to become until you earn its trust. She did not plant anything yet. The ground was not ready. But the space was open, and that was enough. The house, meanwhile, had become something. Not finished, not restored, but inhabited in a way that changed its fundamental character. The wood stove heated the sealed space efficiently, now holding warmth through the night, instead of losing it to gaps that no longer existed. The kitchen sink ran clean water. A shelf near the stove held the tin box, the blueprint pinned to the wall above it. Two chairs sat near the south window, salvaged from a barn sale in Oquasock, where Winona had driven her. On the first day, the knee allowed her to sit in a truck without wincing. Two chairs. The second one remained empty, but it was there. They arrived on a Saturday in early April, 3 months after Midge had left Brunswick. She heard the engine from inside the house and recognized it immediately, not by sound but by instinct. The way a body recognizes the approach of something it has been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. She set down her coffee, stood, walked to the doorway. Three figures beside a car that looked too clean for the gravel road. Clark in front, coat-buttoned, hands at his sides. Noreen slightly behind, her posture still composed, but her eyes moving across the house, the garden, the clearing, taking in information she had not expected to find. Boyd at the rear, standing still, his gaze settling on the turned soil beside the house, the way a person's gaze settles on something they recognize without being able to name. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Clark spoke, and his voice was different from the voice he had used in November. Lower, less certain, carrying weight rather than distributing it. Mom. Midge stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame where the hinges waited still, bolted still, without a door. I'm here, she said. Noreen's eyes had not stopped moving. The roof, the windows catching light, the smoke rising from the chimney in a thin straight line that meant the fire was drawing well, and the flue was clean. This is where you've been. Yes. Boyd said nothing. He was looking at the blueprint through the window, Garrett's handwriting, the square, precise letters. Morning sun, 2 chairs, coffee. Clark stepped forward. His jaw was set, but differently than before. In November, it had been set with certainty. Now it was set against something internal, something he was holding in place through effort rather than conviction. We've been looking for you. You didn't answer, I know. Behind them, Hollis emerged from the side of the house carrying a length of trim board. He paused, assessed the scene, and continued walking to the sawhorse he had set up near the woodpile. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. His presence and the sawdust on his sleeves and the hammer hanging from his belt said everything that required saying. Winona's truck was parked at the far end of the clearing. She was inside the house doing something in the kitchen that involved the sound of water running and a kettle being placed on the stove. She had arrived an hour earlier and had not mentioned leaving. Russell was somewhere behind the house, checking something related to the well pump that he had installed 3 weeks prior, and which he continued to monitor with the protective attention of a man who considers his plumbing work a personal extension of himself. Clark looked at all of this, at the people who were here, at the house that was standing, at his mother, 74 years old, thinner than in November, her hands rougher, her posture straighter, standing in a doorway without a door as if that were the most natural place in the world to stand. You're not alone, Boyd said. No, Midge replied. Something shifted in Clark's face. The rigidity that he wore, the way other men wore confidence, softened not into weakness but into something more honest. He looked at the ground, then at his hands, then at his mother. Mom, I need to tell you something. Midge waited. The house, in Brunswick. I wanted to sell it because Clark started again. Not just for you, for me. The silence held. I made an investment. Real estate. 18 months ago, it went bad. The loss was significant. 180,000. Noreen turned sharply. Clark did not look at her. Denise left. 3 months before we came to see you in November. She took the kids to her mother's. We are not divorced yet, but the conversation has started. He exhaled. The breath was visible in the morning air, a small cloud that formed and disappeared the way confessions do when they are finally released into a space large enough to hold them. I came to your house and told you it was about safety, about your age, about what was practical. And most of that was true. But part of it was about me, about what selling your house would solve for me. Midge looked at her son. She did not look at him the way she had in November, with the guarded patience of a woman being managed. She looked at him the way she had looked at him when he was 9 years old, and had come home with a split lip from a fight he would not explain, with the steady encompassing attention of someone who sees not just the wound, but the fear behind it. I know, she said. Clark blinked. I didn't know the details, but I knew something was wrong. I could see it. The way you held your jaw, the way you talked about the future as if you were already running out of it. She stepped forward. Not far. One step close enough to place her hand on the doorframe between them. The house in Brunswick is yours, all three of you. Decide together what you want to do with it. I won't need it. She reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope thin containing a single document. Clark took it. His fingers trembled in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. But I want you to understand something. Midge continued. I didn't leave because I was angry, and I didn't come here to prove anything to anyone. She glanced back at the house, at the walls she had patched, at the roof Hollis had rebuilt, at the floor plan pinned above the stove, its pencil lines fading but legible. I came because this was something that was never finished, and I needed to finish it, not for your father, for both of us. Noreen was crying. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way that people cry when they have been holding an opinion for months, and it has just been replaced by something they did not expect and cannot argue with. Boyd moved first. He walked past Clark, past Midge, into the house. He stood before the blueprint for a long time. Then he looked at the porch notation. Morning sun, 2 chairs coffee. He built it for you, Boyd said. Yes. Boyd nodded slowly. Then he took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and looked at Hollis, who was watching from the sawhorse with the expression of a man who has seen this particular moment before and knows what comes next. What needs doing? Boyd said. Hollis pointed the trim board toward the doorway, the frame where the hinges waited. She needs a door. The rest of the day moved differently from any day that had preceded it. Not faster, more populated. Clark stood beside Russell for an hour, learning how to wrap pipe insulation. His banker's hands clumsy with the adhesive but persistent in a way that Russell acknowledged with a single grunt of approval. Noreen walked through the house room by room, touching surfaces, reading the evidence of labor and decision that was written into every wall and joint and patch section of roof. And whatever she was assembling in her mind, from that evidence, it was not what she had arrived expecting to find. Boyd worked with Hollis. He was not skilled, but he was attentive, and he followed instructions without asking why, which was the quality Hollis valued most in an assistant. Because it meant the work could proceed at the speed of the work, rather than the speed of conversation. Midge did not direct. She did not manage. She continued her own tasks, moving through the house the way she had moved through it every day for 3 months, with the quiet efficiency of a person who belongs where she is and does not need to prove it. In the late afternoon, Hollis brought the door. It was ash. He had milled it himself from a tree he had felled in the autumn before the ground froze. He had not mentioned it. He had not asked whether she wanted it. He had seen the blueprint, seen the notation front door, ash 3-point hinge, and he had built it, not as a gift, as a completion. They hung it together. Hollis and Boyd on the hinges, Clark holding the frame plumb. Midge watching from 3 feet away, her hands, still her eyes on the gap between the door edge and the frame. Hollis adjusted the top hinge, shaved a 16th of an inch from the latch side with a hand plane, repositioned. Checked the gap with a folded piece of paper that he slid along the edge the way Garrett used to feeling for the places where the fit was too tight or too loose. "Try it," he said, stepping back. Midge moved forward. She placed her hand flat against the ash. The grain was tight and even sanded smooth, sealed with something that smelled faintly of linseed oil. She could feel the weight of it, solid but not heavy, balanced on hinges that Hollis had set with the same care Garrett would have used 3 points of contact, each one bearing its share. She pushed. The door swung inward, smooth, silent, describing an arc through the air that carried no resistance, no friction, no argument. Then she pulled it closed. The latch met the strike plate, and the door settled into the frame with a sound that traveled through her hand, through her arm, through the architecture of her body, and arrived somewhere behind her ribs, where it met something that had been waiting for it for 3 years. Click. Clean, quiet, definitive. The sound of a thing fitting exactly where it belonged. Midge kept her hand on the door. She did not move. She did not speak. Behind her, no one else spoke either, because the sound had been heard by everyone, and everyone understood that it was not just a mechanical event. It was an answer to a question that had been asked in pencil on a piece of drafting paper and had taken 20 years and 3 months and 1 winter and 1 storm and 1 fall and 1 village and 1 family and 1 woman who refused to be finished to answer. The light outside was golden. Late afternoon in April in Maine, when the sun drops low enough to enter rooms sideways, finding surfaces it had missed all winter, illuminating things that had been there all along but had not yet been seen. It came through the south window now and fell across the 2 chairs and the floor and the hands of a woman who was standing in her own doorway, in her own house, in a life she had chosen. And it was warm. Clark stood behind her. His eyes were red, but his jaw was no longer set against anything. It was simply there, part of his face, part of the man he was becoming now, that the man he had tried to be had been allowed to rest. "We're not selling the Brunswick house," he said. Midge did not turn. "We've talked about it. On the drive up. We're going to keep it. Go back sometimes. Bring the kids. Clean it up. Stay a while." A pause. It doesn't feel like something to lose anymore. Midge let the words settle. They did not need a response. They needed space, and space was the one thing she had learned to provide. Noreen called to Clark about gathering something from the car before dark. Boyd was helping Hollis carry tools to the truck. Somewhere behind the house, Russell was explaining the well pump to no one in particular, narrating its function with the quiet pride of a man who believes plumbing is the highest form of civilization. When the time came to leave, it happened the way endings happen when they are not really endings. Slowly, without urgency. Noreen hugged her brief and firm, her composure cracking for exactly 2 seconds before she reconstructed it and walked to the car. Clark stayed a moment longer, standing beside Midge in the doorway, looking at the door, not saying anything, because there was nothing left that words could improve. Boyd was last. He paused on the step and looked back at the garden plot, the turned soil, the stones marking its border. "What are you planting?" "I haven't decided yet." He smiled. The kind of smile that does not need to reach the eyes because it is coming from somewhere deeper. "Elise made you something," he said, and handed her a folded piece of paper. Midge opened it. A crayon drawing of a house with a red door and a garden full of flowers that were taller than the windows. In the garden, a stick figure with gray hair and 2 circles for hands. Above the figure, in a child's uncertain letters, "Grandma's house." Midge folded the paper carefully and placed it in her coat pocket beside the envelope that used to hold the deed. "I'll see you again," she said. Not a hope, a certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from standing in a finished doorway. She watched the car until it disappeared into the trees. Then she turned back. Hollis was still there. He was sitting on the step, hands on his knees, looking at the lake, which had opened fully. Now the ice gone, the water dark and still, and reflecting a sky that was beginning to deepen toward evening. Midge sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who have said what matters and are now simply sitting inside the result. After a while, Hollis stood. He picked up his thermos, tucked his gloves into his coat pocket, and walked toward his truck. At the driver's door, he paused. June would have liked this place, he said. Then he drove away. Midge sat alone on the step. The evening settled around her soft and unhurried, the air carrying the smell of thawed earth and wood smoke and the faint mineral scent of the lake. A loon called once from somewhere across the water, a single note that rose and held and faded into the stillness. She stood, walked inside. The fire was low but alive, the coals glowing in the stove with the patient heat of something that knows it will be needed again in the morning. She touched the blueprint on the wall, the pencil lines, the notations, the rooms that existed now not as drawings, but as spaces she had walked through and worked in and slept in, and nearly given up in and chosen every morning to remain in. Morning sun, 2 chairs, coffee. She looked at the 2 chairs by the window. One had a dent in the seat from where she sat each morning. The other was smooth, unused, waiting with the patience of furniture, which is infinite. She placed Elise's drawing on the windowsill beside the chair that was hers, where the morning light would find it first. Then she walked to the door, her door, the one that Hollis had built from ash and Garrett had designed in pencil, and she had closed for the first time that afternoon, with a sound that meant the house was finished and the life inside it could begin. She opened it, stood in the frame, felt the evening air against her face, cool and clean, and carrying the sound of water and the last light moving across the surface of the lake. She closed the door. Click. And this time the sound did not remind her of something she had lost. It was the sound of something she had built, something that fit, something that held. If this story stayed with you, I want to ask you something before you go. Is there something in your life that is still waiting to be finished? Not forgotten, not abandoned, just waiting. You don't have to answer out loud. But I hope you'll sit with the question for a moment the way Midge sat with hers. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not start something new. It's to go back and finish what matters. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, you're always welcome.